and that the key way to change our culture and our gendered norms is to interrupt the violence right now, as well as doing all the primary prevention sort of work that we're doing. But if you don't interrupt the violence, the culture doesn't change.
One for Mum, one for Dad, one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be in Australia.
Dead, buried, cremated.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. And here at the Australia Institute, we deal a lot with numbers and statistics. In fact, most of our economists spend all day crunching big numbers and figures. But these numbers are shocking.
1 in 4 women has experienced physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner.
1.2 million women currently living in Australia are either living in a violent relationship or have lived in a violent relationship.
120. That's how many seconds go by between police call-outs to domestic violence incidents in Australia.
That's one every 2 minutes, all day, every day.
Because this is the story of how gender inequality contributes to the murder of one Australian woman almost every week.
A new book, See What You Made Me Do, by investigative journalist Jess Hill, takes a look at the national emergency that is domestic violence, or what Jess now calls domestic abuse. And a trigger warning. Some of the content we are going to discuss and the clips of various government anti-violence campaigns may be upsetting for some listeners, and they might not be appropriate for young ears. Jess, you talk about the term domestic abuse rather than domestic violence right at the beginning of the book, and that you had to change the book to update that language. I guess I wanted to kick off by asking, why did that resonate with you, and how late into this book did that come?
About 4 weeks before we went to print, after 3.5 years into a writing process, so pretty late. And I was really torn, actually, because domestic violence is already an inadequate term to describe the experience of abuse in the home. And by downgrading it, seemingly, even more to domestic abuse, part of me just felt like, wow, we're making it even more banal and benign sounding. But the other part of me was remembering all of those women who had said to me at various points, how are you going to communicate the fact that actually, for a lot of women, the worst part of the violence is not physical. And in fact, some women don't experience any physical violence at all. And those can be some of the most terrifying relationships. And my responses to them had always been kind of lame in the past, like, well, here's how I'm going to explain it. And I'm going to, all these caveats. But when I saw this opinion piece by Yasmin Khan, who runs a domestic violence service up in Brisbane, she just made it really clear that it's like, the term domestic violence is stopping women from realising they're in abusive relationships, because if they don't experience violence, or if that's not top of mind for them, even if they experience physical violence, but that's actually not something that they see themselves experiencing, which is a complex, concept, but that's quite true for a lot of victims, that they won't see themselves as victims. The police in the UK have made this change for precisely that reason, so that women will be able to hear themselves in that term. And so I was walking down the street, reading my phone, pushing a pram. Do not do that at home. And I was reading this opinion piece and I was like, we just have to change it. Even if I feel uncomfortable about it, I just know it's the right thing to do. And generally speaking, it's all been good feedback about it. I'm sure some people feel uncomfortable with changing the term, but for me, that's how I prefer to speak about it.
And I thought that you did such a good job right from the beginning of really hooking the reader to the extent of the problem, the enormity of it, and how inadequate our response has been to it. But just going back to those statistics right at the beginning, they're very shocking. Do you think we still really understand the extent of this problem and that it can happen to anyone?
I think some of us do, but I think it's pretty shocking how many people say that they're only just waking up to that, or still say, but isn't this just a problem for working class families or people with drug addiction or alcohol addiction? So I think that at the moment, there are various different states of awareness that are operating in Australia. Some people have incredible awareness about domestic abuse, people who haven't got any other reason apart from just their interest in being aware about things. Other people still have their awareness back in the 70s, So even though we've had this incredible awakening in Australia to the idea and the concept of domestic abuse and how many people it affects, and of course having Rosie Batty become basically the involuntary primary ambassador for this cause, and her being from a very, an obviously middle class background, that's obviously taken that awareness to the next level.
Family violence happens to everybody, no matter how nice your house is, how intelligent you are. It happens to anyone and everyone. And this has been an 11-year battle.
When you speak to police, they always say the same things. Of course it affects everyone. You talk to police from every different postcode and they're all spending a good amount of their time responding to domestic abuse call-outs. It's not just Mount Druitt in Sydney or the sort of like down and out suburbs in every state. It's, like I live in Bondi in the sort of ritzy eastern suburbs, and their police there deal with incredible numbers of domestic abuse call-outs. It just looks a bit different often to what we're seeing in some of the other suburbs. There might be less overt physical violence, less sort of like neighbourhood disturbance, because it's happening behind closed doors. If if we have closed doors as a hierarchy in the richer areas, closed doors are just that bit thicker, for most people. So yeah, I think that's a project that's certainly not finished.
In her book, Jess writes that it's not a crime to alienate your wife from her family or to cut up the credit card, as in this public awareness campaign by the Sutherland Shire Council.
Oh, she wants money for petrol now. How bloody hopeless. Only just cut up her credit card too.
Mate, pull your head in.
Domestic violence isn't just about physical assault. Speak up against all forms of domestic violence.
If you have a disability and your partner or carer stops you getting the support you need, that is violence or abuse, and it is not okay.
I think that we have taken a regular assault-like approach to domestic violence or domestic abuse in terms of the criminal justice system, and it bears little to no relationship with the actual experience that most victims have, where the most terrifying things that happen to them are quite often the psychological violence. That's not to say that physical violence isn't important and isn't worth prosecuting, but the fact is, at the moment, police really have no motivation or reason to investigate the full arc of an abusive relationship. And thus, it's very easy for police to get it wrong, especially when they're perhaps, junior first responders, maybe don't have a very clear understanding of the dynamics of abuse, or on the other hand, sort of like, old dudes who've been around the traps for a long time and hold, victims in contempt, which unfortunately is a pretty broadly held position amongst police. It's easy for them to come to a scene where especially if there's been a strangulation and the victim has defended herself often by scratching or biting, and the guy is the only one bearing any physical injuries. So who do you think the perpetrator is there? Well, these are the sort of situations where women are being arrested and being nailed as the perpetrator. There's no reason for police at the moment, unless they feel unusually motivated to do so, to investigate the full arc of what's happened, because all they're trying to do is basically see if there's a charge to be laid around a physical assault, or if there's, broadly an intervention order that needs placing. But it's all based around one-off incidents. And domestic abuse is not a one-off incident. If it is just a one-off incident and only happens once, I mean, yes, that's serious, but absolutely nothing compared to years of ongoing violence. And the psychological violence, really what we're talking about, is a violence that is centered around humiliation. And the physical expression of that, that's just one part of it. It's not like the physical is in the foreground. In the foreground is humiliation, degradation, and in a lot of these relationships, control. The physical violence is just another way of reinforcing that system, but there are plenty of other ways of doing that. And that's why, a lot of the more sophisticated abusers don't use physical violence at all, because that's exactly what gets them in trouble with the police. If you know what you're doing, and not all of these guys do, but if you are conscious of what you're doing, why would you use physical violence and put yourself at risk of arrest?
Dad was pretty good today, wasn't he, Mum?
Yeah. Family violence has no good days. Talk to a friend or visit vic.gov.au/family violence support.
What is different about Jess Hill's work is that rather than focusing exclusively on the victim and asking that question we've all asked too many times, why didn't she leave? In her book, Jess instead asks, why did he do it? She puts the spotlight on the perpetrators and how the justice system often reinforces abuse.
I got really angry and I just gave her a slap. Stuff happens. But she knows, she deserved it.
Yeah, I know this bloke, and we all know he hits his girlfriend. Never in front of people, but she won't do anything. I can't say anything, can I?
Well, you just lose control sometimes. It's only shoving and stuff. It's not like I'm one of those blokes who beats up on a woman.
So, in the Perpetrator's Handbook, I outline essentially the basic techniques of what we call coercive control, which is one form of domestic abuse. I divide it into two loose categories, and I say loose because there are some perpetrators who will cross between the two, and sometimes it won't be absolutely clear which category the perpetrator fits into, but other times it's really, it's clear as the nose on your face. So coercive control is the kind of abuse that really is about not just about responding in the moment to an argument or to a feeling of vulnerability, but about a systematic campaign of domination and control, where the perpetrator, either consciously or subconsciously, basically sets out to create a patriarchy in miniature in their household. And they do that using the same sorts of techniques, whether they're using them instrumentally or they're using them reflexively. And that is basically that they end up isolating their victim from supportive connections. They monopolize their perception, which is to say that they turn the victim's perception inwards on her faults and what she might be doing to make the abuse occur, which makes it difficult for her to see what the perpetrator is doing. So it puts her in the foreground, much like we do in the media. We put the victim in the foreground. That's what the perpetrator does. Says, if you weren't so this, I wouldn't be so that. They also alternate punishments with rewards. So it's very rare that a relationship will just be unrelentingly abusive. There is love and kindness, often sometimes to lesser degrees as the relationship goes on. Other times it stays that way the whole time, even when there's the type of savagery that is just unthinkable that's occurring. Key to a coercive control situation is the inducement of debility and exhaustion. So many women say, it was the middle of the night, I was in bed, and he just kicked me out of bed. It's amazing how many women share that particular experience. Now, the perpetrator in that moment has probably been stewing on something for weeks or for hours, lying in bed, and then finally just gets so cooked up that they push her out of bed. But to the woman, it comes completely out of nowhere. Other things can be that they are gaslighting them. So they induce debility and exhaustion by basically denying the very thing that is happening right in front of their faces. That might be that they hit them and then turn around and say, I didn't hit you. Or they might actually hide things to make the victim feel like they're going insane. And then there are other methods like demonstrating omnipotence, which can be done by just text messaging dozens and dozens of times a day, or they may go as far as installing surveillance apps on their phones or GPS devices in their cars so they always know where they're going or where they've been. Then there's the degradation, which is at the heart of humiliation, and threats. And threats are often the most effective when they're made against not just the victim, but against her family, against her children, against her pets. You know, it's basically creating an atmosphere of confusion and extreme threat to the point where it doesn't feel like anyone, not the law, not just nobody, will ever be more powerful than the perpetrator. And that's what the perpetrator sets out to achieve, as I said, either consciously, as a smaller percentage of perpetrators do, or subconsciously. And what's weird is that the same system of behaviours emerge whether the perpetrator is conscious of what they're doing and are strategic, or whether they're unconscious of what they're doing. It's the same thing. That is one of the most confounding things to get your head around. That's just the coercive controllers. Obviously, the insecure reactors are a lot more haphazard, and it's not revolving around a system of domination and control. So there are plenty of people who will live in an abusive relationship for years and only see sort of bits and pieces of a coercive controller's tactics or behaviours, but they won't have the whole system in place. And those are the guys who are much more likely to go to a men's behaviour change program or are much more open to being reformed. The coercive controllers are probably the hardest. There are some people who will be listening who don't relate to having a whole system of domination and control in place. And that is, a really common experience of domestic abuse.
Don't try like a girl, mate. Come on.
Jess, can you explain what role shame plays for perpetrators?
So it's a complicated sort of concept to talk about quickly, but essentially it's really important to understand the difference between privilege and entitlement. So when we talk about domestic abuse, a lot of the times we talk about male privilege. You know, they do it to reinforce privilege, they do it because they're privileged, etc., etc. And a lot of men get really pissed off with that because they're like, well, how am I privileged compared to a millionaire in Wallara, rich area of Sydney, that sort of thing. So we have these circular arguments about it. But what we're actually dealing with in domestic abuse is entitlement. And entitlement is strong whether you're living, in poverty or whether you're working in, corporate Australia. And what at the core of that dominant form of masculinity is a feeling that I should be in power, but I'm not as powerful as I think I should be, and then I'm angry, right? So that is it's this humiliation plus entitlement. And this is what I found to be really at the root of a lot of domestic abuse. It's what, a number of people who've worked in this field have found. It's what a psychoanalyst, Helen Block-Lewis, called humiliated fury, which is this sense that there's a deep shame operating inside the abuser. And they feel in their intimate relationships, rightly or wrongly, mostly wrongly, that they have been disrespected and that they are not being given the power and rights to which they are due. And so they respond with fury, or they respond by taking control. Now, humiliated fury is one part of it, but I think what we know and what we're talking about now with masculinity is that, that basically patriarchy instills in men the sense that the best way to be is to be autonomous, independent, unemotional, unattached. Now, that's completely unnatural as a way to live. We are relational beings. That's actually the secret to our success as a species.
As a boy, he learns that women aren't equal to men from a very early age. Even though both his parents work, on the weekends his mum does the housework while Dad watches sport. When he cries about being bullied at school, his dad tells him to stop being such a girl and just punch him right back. Technically speaking, we'd say that these social norms, practices and structures have shaped both the boy and the girl, creating a society where women are valued less and men are expected to be dominant and in control.
When boys are raised with that really just reinforced time and again, even if not by their parents but by society, they tend to cut off that emotional side of them. They don't actually learn how to be intimate. And so what you get is this kind of, as one perpetrator described it, a type of counterfeit intimacy, where they set out in a relationship. They're very engaged in the relationship to begin with. There's what they call love bombing. It's a fantasy. But as soon as it starts to become real, and as soon as they might actually have to reveal parts of themselves they feel uncomfortable with, or be vulnerable or compromise, or not just have the woman basically 100% devoted to their needs, that's when their mask starts to sort of drop. And behind that, in abusive men, often you find just a really angry, wounded narcissist. And you get women saying that their partners were narcissistic, or they had narcissistic personality disorder. When you actually look at these guys, they don't necessarily have a personality disorder, but they are often inherently narcissistic because they've been raised to be distant from their own emotionality and to see a connection to that as shameful. So it ends up being that they become this sort of shell of themselves. And to everyone else around them, they might seem totally fine, because it's actually only intimacy for a lot of these guys that's going to make the mask drop. So when people say, oh, he can't be like that, I know him really well, you know him really well as a friend, or you know him really well as a colleague. You don't know him really well as an intimate partner. And when intimacy sets this off, it is like a Jekyll and Hyde character, because the Dr. Jekyll is the mask that they've been able to keep on, and the Mr. Hyde is what sits behind that. And so I think that, where shame comes in, it's this sense of deep shame around disconnection from emotionality, around feeling like they hate the fact that they are feeling more dependent and that they're feeling these stirrings of love that might actually make them have to be connected to someone. And they react by either wanting to take control of the relationship and set it on their terms only, reduce the woman to just a compliant sort of slave so that there'll never be any sort of need for them to compromise. Or they feel this rage overwhelming them at various times in ways that they just don't feel like they can regulate. It really depends on the guy. But I think when we talk about shame and when we talk about what men have had to sacrifice in order to be, proper functioning members of patriarchy, I find that it's much easier to get men to listen because it speaks to their experience. If we just say, oh, they're privileged and they're doing this to maintain their privilege, it doesn't talk to why guys do this. A lot of guys don't just do it for that reason. There's really complicated reasons they do these things. And they want, I think a lot of guys who've been through this too, they want to be talked to as though they're people, and they're probably going to be a lot more open to hearing more from us if we treat them as though they aren't just two-dimensional foot soldiers of patriarchy. I'm not saying every guy's going to be receptive. A lot of guys are just going to shut out everything. That's a pretty common trait, especially for coercive controllers. But for the low-hanging fruit, for the guys who are receptive, I'm finding that this is a real way in. I've had so much good feedback from a lot of guys who have been in this situation who are like, this is the first time someone's really articulated what it actually felt like for me.
Since Rosie Batty led the charge against domestic violence following the murder of her son Luke by his own father, there has been a real increase in public awareness around domestic abuse and also an increased commitment by politicians to address the issue.
Labor was offering $60 million to support 5,000 women a year fleeing domestic violence.
To support women and their children who have made the very brave decision to leave a violent situation.
And so that's why I'm proud to announce a program which does focus on prevention, some $68.3 million in prevention.
I find it difficult to believe that Lisa Wilkinson's salary being less than Carl Stefanovic's, or a shortage of female CEOs, or even women doing more unpaid domestic work than men, which are often cited as indications of female inequality, have anything to do with domestic violence.
The federal government's 12-year national plan to reduce violence against women and their children is a decade in, and $723 million of federal money has been committed on top of state and territory funding. The goals plan is admirable, a significant and sustained reduction in sexual assault and domestic violence by 2022. But the plan has no measurable targets, and the money has mostly gone to awareness campaigns like this one.
Pop those down next. You're okay.
Just did it because he likes you.
Violence against women starts with disrespect. The excuses we make allow it to grow. Violence against women. Let's stop it at the start. Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
A recent audit found the plan is not on track to meet its goal. And now the Morrison government has appointed former Coalition Minister for Families, Kevin Andrews, and One Nation Senator Pauline Hanson to a new committee to review the current family law court system, as well as things like costs and child custody arrangements.
I'm hearing of too many cases where children, or parents I should say, are using domestic violence to stop the other parent from seeing their children. Perjury is in our system.
You're saying these are false claims of domestic violence?
Most definitely, yes.
There has been a loud opposition from anti-domestic violence campaigners to this review.
If we put this off for another 12 months, it means more lives will be lost. Parliamentarians and politicians are not experts in domestic violence. And once again, we have to ask our clients and survivors of domestic violence to come forward again and tell their stories after multiple inquiries have found that the system fails them.
The comments of Pauline Hanson, in the context of being made the co-chair of the committee, which will receive evidence, it would appear from those comments that Pauline Hanson has already judged what that evidence is and is saying that people don't tell the truth.
On the whole, is Jess hopeful that things will change?
I guess I operate from a basic state of hope, even in spite of the evidence. I think that certainly we are at a point sort of unmatched at any time, I think, during history, where we have the tools and the understanding to really take this on, and not just take it on in a law and order sense, but in a true reforming way. Whether we are going to do that, I don't know. To be honest, I don't feel like anyone can predict anything politically at the moment. But what I am seeing, I guess, is communities also taking this on themselves and not waiting for government. Communities finding strategies that work and basically showing that they work, and then going to government and saying, now will you support us? Now, I don't know whether the government's actually going to step up. I would really help if there was a government in power that actually had a commitment to reducing domestic abuse. I think right now it's very much in the too hard basket. I think the government's sort of overt commitment to, I guess, really foregrounding primary prevention, which is all the idea that if we change attitudes and gendered norms, that we will reduce domestic violence that way. I'm really angered by that, because I think that is one part of a much bigger puzzle, and that the key way to change our culture and our gendered norms is to interrupt the violence right now, as well as doing all the primary prevention sort of work that we're doing. But if you don't interrupt the violence, the culture doesn't change, because you have another generation of children growing up with a display of power that resonates with them in all different ways, but that shows a number of children that the way to be powerful is to have power over, and that maybe they're not worth anything more than being overpowered by someone else. It's a diabolical situation. We can't just expect to change that through respectful relationships programs in schools and trying to tell children, well, that's not the way it should be, because that's the way they'll see that it is. And we're looking at the moment, the best figure we have is that around 1 in 4 children will grow up in some sort of form of domestic abuse. Like, that is just unacceptable, and that's what needs to change now. And at the moment, the government has basically thrown up the white flag for the last part of the National Prevention Plan to reduce violence, and said that basically until we change gendered norms and attitudes in 10 plus years, we won't see any reduction in the rates of domestic abuse. And I just think that's unconscionable to give up like that, when we've had such amazing progress on other seemingly intractable public health issues like smoking, drink driving. We can do this we just don't believe we can do it, or we're not willing to burn the political capital to do it properly. Basically, community groups, non-profit groups, are having to take it on themselves more and more because government is, I think, to a large extent, just giving up.
Come on then. What happened?
Got detention, just for flicking up a girl's skirt.
What?
That's it.
Doesn't she know that's just boys being boys?
Yeah, I mean, I've already accepted that as I grow up, I'll probably be harassed and even abused.
Sorry, that's not what I meant.
Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
Jess gives the example of how the community of Burke managed to make a huge dent on incidents of domestic abuse with a whole-of-community approach.
Burke had consistently some of the highest rates of domestic abuse in New South Wales. It was the Sydney Morning Herald published a hyperbolic headline about it, which called it basically per capita the most dangerous town in the world. I mean, obviously it's not the most dangerous town in the world, but its crime rates were incredibly high. And looking at that, there was an Indigenous leader in Burke, Alastair Ferguson, who thought there are millions and millions of dollars pouring into services in Burke, and yet none of this is changing. So what are we not doing? And he started looking around for different ways that they could maybe do things differently. And he found this strategy called justice reinvestment. And justice reinvestment basically looks to reduce the prison population by investing in people before they commit violence. And what Alastair saw that they'd had remarkable success in Texas, of all places, where Republican politicians had voted for a justice reinvestment strategy, and it had actually meant that they could shut down a prison rather than what they'd forecast, which was to build a whole bunch of new ones. So in Burke, they really focused, to begin with, on circuit breakers. How could they prevent young men from going into a life of crime and just, ending up in jail like all their friends? So they did a whole bunch of things around, say, for example, unlicensed driving, around truanting, really creative strategies to basically stop those men being picked up for misdemeanor crimes or for things that were more serious by intervening at the points where they were at most risk. But then the police picked it up, and the police were like, "This is really inspiring." Now, what they saw as inspiring was that in Burke, Alastair Ferguson and others there basically negotiated a treaty between the 20-something tribal groups there and got them all to work together and basically said, we need to work together, all of us, but also we need to work together with the service agencies. We need to work together with the police. So they'd have regular meetings. And when I say regular, like daily, they'd have daily meetings, and they'd have one big weekly meeting with all of the service agencies that they could muster in Burke. And they would work cases, one by one and share information, which, should not be radical, but it actually is. So the police saw that and thought, this is really key to how we combat domestic abuse in this town. They started this thing called Operation Solidarity, what it was about perpetrator visibility. So when they'd get reports, they'd go to the house, but instead of just making threats to arrest, they would say, what is it that this family needs in order for the perpetrator to perhaps choose to stop violence? So sometimes that would mean taking a community leader with them who could say to them, as he did to one of these guys who was a, problem caller, look, mate, it used to be fine to beat up Auntie and we'd turn a blind eye, but that's not the case anymore. And so what we've got to do is we've got to work together to find a way to have you stop your violence, because otherwise, we're not going to put up with it. And so they would work with people on if it was alcohol, drug abuse, unemployment, mental illness, whatever it was that was going on in their lives, to try to get them to make the rational choice to stop abusing. Now, what they found over 2 years of this Operation Solidarity coming off the back of this justice reinvestment program is they had a 40% reduction in repeat assault, a 40% reduction in domestic violence assaults. And they also had an enormous reduction in the number of domestic homicides in the general area. Not to mention the corollary statistics, which was increases in the percentage of school attendance, increases in the number of students graduating. So what they were showing is that actually when you do this whole of community approach, which is about collaboration, it's about collecting the right data so they know the problem they're dealing with, that you not only reduce crime, but you increase all the other positive indicators. And they've both got to happen at the same time. So I think what Burke shows, and justice-free investment is a proven strategy that is being trialled, I think, in a few different areas in Australia. I think the ACT is looking at it too. That if you get the community on board and get them to start collaborating and not have the services competing with one another, you can have incredible results. And the fact is, it doesn't actually require that much more work, because actually all of these agencies and groups and the police, they're already working really hard on this one issue, but they're often working at cross purposes. So instead of working at cross purposes and doing all and repeating all the same work with the same people without even knowing it, it's like, here's a way for us to actually conserve our resources and work together. Change is possible, but we have to believe that it's possible. Do something as though you believe it can change.
That's been episode 39 of Follow the Money, brought to you by the Australia Institute. I recorded this interview with Jess Hill on the 3rd of September 2019, so some events may have changed since then. You can buy See What You Made Me Do from blackinkbooks.com.au or at any good bookstore. Go to our website at tai.org.au where you can find more of our research. You can listen free to Follow the Money wherever you find your favourite podcasts, or you can go back and listen to all our previous episodes on our website. We're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a N_T. Jess Hill is at Jess Radio. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macy. The theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum. Thanks for listening.